Okay, so very warm welcome. Thank you for rocking up, turning up, and I hope that it's not quite as dreary where you are as it is here. I'm in a bedroom in my house in Malvern, and it's been raining all day. So, trauma-informed practice. This presentation, this sharing for the next 40 minutes or so, is a very short introduction to trauma-informed practice, and it's really for anybody that comes into contact with people who they notice from time to time display signs of stress, anxiety, and so forth. So it seems like a really heavy subject, this, but actually, as I hope you'll pick up as we go through it, there's been so much research, so much support now for working with trauma and supporting those with trauma, that I think it's a really exciting area to be working with in. And whilst that in no way do I want that to undermine the seriousness of traumatic experiences and the aftermath of that, it's fantastic that in the last sort of 5 to 10 years we've been able to look at trauma in a new way, lots of new ways, in fact, as I'll come on to. It's a huge topic, so please recognize that in this what I'm sharing with you today. I believe that more than ever in this circumstance that we're in right now globally, it's more important than ever for organizations and individuals who work with others, parents too, carers in families, to be aware of the definitions of trauma, the impact of trauma, and how to support. So what's in this brief introduction to trauma-informed practice? So first of all, why be interested in psychological trauma? So I'm going to share a little bit of the backdrop to trauma, what psychological trauma is and how you can recognize it. And for some of you, I'm sure you'll be familiar with both the kind of primary but also the secondary signs that somebody is carrying trauma. And then importantly, how can you respond to it in ways that are supportive and safe? And this presentation today, we're very much working on the basis of a coaching style working with it rather than a psychotherapeutic approach to working with it. So it's really what approaches that will be available to people who haven't had specialist training in this area. So I hope what you'll take away from this is more understanding and knowledge, perhaps a confirmation of some of the knowledge that you have, and importantly, some ways that you can respond, and not just you personally in situations that you're in, but also raise some questions about organizational responses to trauma. So how can we be both supportive to those who experience it, but also preventative of it as well? So here I am today, former science teacher, so I've got a background in education. I was a senior school leader, and for the past 20 years, having done a master's degree in counselling and explored with other qualifications, coaching, hypnotherapy and emotional freedom technique, amongst other approaches. I work in private practice now in schools supporting adults and young people, particularly those with anxiety related symptoms, and also run training through my own business, but also through the University of Worcester in coaching and other related approaches. I work also a lot with head teachers, and I'm just about to begin, I don't know why I've agreed to do this right now, but a doctoral research study into using emotional freedom technique with post-traumatic stress disorder. So that's me looking very professional on the screen there, although most of the time I look like this these days, as I think we all appreciate we all do right now. As I said earlier, I do get very excited. So this is me looking excited with my partner a few weeks ago, a few months ago, quite actually a couple of years ago. So I do get very excited and very passionate about sharing these ideas and this information with you, because I think it makes a massive difference to people. If all that you come away with from a session like this is more awareness and more understanding, then it will have a positive impact on the people that you work with. So I'd like to begin with actually where most trauma support treatment interventions start, by looking at strengths. So I'm just going to give you a few minutes to do a little bit of private reflection. So if you could just stay muted for the moment on this, and I'd love to just bring in some of your perspectives on this in a few moments' time. But I'd like you to pause for a moment, and I'd like to invite you to think back over the past few months to all the ways that you feel good about what you've overcome. We've been going through some pretty substantial change, and I think there are very few people that haven't been impacted in some way through the global pandemic and the issues that have risen from that, and how that layers in on top of your work commitments, your voluntary commitments, your family commitments, and so forth. So what problems have you overcome? What problems have you solved? What difficulties have you dealt with? And I'd encourage you, as you think about what you've overcome and what you feel good about, just to notice how this feels, to notice the good feelings and any positive thoughts that come. And in particular, as you think about these things, to notice where they're located in your body. So where is the physical location of the feeling of, you know, last week I managed to run my first Zoom, or whatever it is. Last week I managed to console, as I was doing, my one of my elderly parents last week who's going through a difficult time. So, and if it's possible, add some labels to the strengths or the attitudes that you brought up these last 5 or 6 months or so. So I'm just going to give you a moment just to reflect on that. So what you feel good about, where you feel that in your body, any labels you might give to the strengths or attitudes that come up. So what I invite now, and I appreciate that we've been dealing with a lot, and maybe you would like more time to do this, but just in terms of the initial things that have come up for you, either if you're happy to unmute yourself and speak, or jot it into the chat at the bottom. Just one or two of the good feelings, the location, and any labels that you give to that. We call it the somatic sense in our work with trauma, and it's a very potent, relatively new way of working with trauma and cognitive experience. But recent research has begun to show us that people have a very physical reaction to traumatic experiences, and that physicality, we can work with that, and it's one of the whole kind of new areas of psychotherapy to look at somatic approaches to dealing with that. So Sharon, thank you for a beautiful segue into the later part, and thank you for sharing so clearly and succinctly your experience. And I wish we had time to hear more of those today. But I just wonder if you could just, for yourself, just notice, where is your somatic felt sense of whatever it was that you came to as a strength, or something that you've overcome, that good feeling. So why be interested in psychological or emotional trauma? The KublerRoss grief cycle, this is a variation on it. It also, you can find similar approaches in motivational interviewing, Prochaska and de Clement, and others. And over the course of the last few months, I'm wondering if you can identify with any of the stages that we are supposed to go through according to this theory when we go through change. And so just to highlight here, and incidentally, we aren't supposed to go through these in order. We also aren't supposed to just have one. There might be a whole range of different aspects and angles on the experiences we've been having in our lives in the last 9 to 10 months, but obviously before that too. So we might experience initially a sense of shock and confusion, a kind of rabbit in the headlights. What's this? And then a sort of drawing back and a kind of denial. We may get strong emotions, anger, sadness, hurt, fear, guilt, all sorts of emoting experiences. We might then have a period of withdrawal where we kind of step back. And that withdrawal may lead to something that becomes more clinical in terms of the withdrawal from motivation and energy, and might become something more akin to what we might call depression. We might then move into adapting. And adapting is where we're trying to work with what we already have and to make it fit the new circumstances. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. We might also experience then, and lovely link back to what Sharon was talking about there, about accepting this idea that we can, at some level, we can start to become at peace with things. So even though it's not okay, it is okay. We're okay with it not being okay. And we can start to move towards some sort of acceptance and peace. And that might lead to ultimately to a sense of integration, a feeling and an experience of what I think is a really overused phrase, a new normal. And we might reach that point. I wonder to what extent you can identify with these stages, perhaps for yourself over the last few months, for the people that you support and work with, your own family members, and even actually, as Anne and I were chatting at the beginning, even family pets too. We've got a fairly young dog in the house. She's mercifully not here right now. She's with the neighbours. But that dog has really had challenges with us being around so much, and the whole kind of separation aspect of that. So I wonder for you what your experiences have been of this. And I'm going to leave you with a link at the end of the presentation that you might find interesting, which expands on this idea of the change grief cycle, and actually offers you some strategies for each of those stages of grief, should you find yourself or others in that kind of place. So there's some suggestions of some ways you might be able to respond at that time. So the reason why I bring this into this session is around that shock and confusion, trauma, but as a kind of related earlier to the idea of the somatic sense, this bodily sense, it's also a state in the body as well. And what's fascinating about the study of trauma is that we've always, well, I say we have always, for many years as a coach, as a counsellor, as a therapist, we've talked about the mind and the body. And I work part of my my working week, I was going to say is, but used to be working in a centre, a holistic therapy centre, and we talk there about the whole person. And trauma study is really bringing into focus this idea that we are not. We've often talked about the mind and body as being separate entities, and in some senses our health systems treat even parts of the body as very separate entities. But the study of somatic psychology, somatic psychotherapy, is showing us that more than ever, there's a lot of evidence that shows that when we are psychologically disturbed, our body's disturbed too. So trauma is a neurological state, but it's a physical state. So when I say neurological, I mean it's the whole nervous system. It's not just what's going on up here, as we like to think of it. And it's a natural survival state. And having just recently got a puppy, it's so interesting to watch how a puppy is triggered off by things it hasn't met before, and how that triggers it into this very awake, very alert state, which is also very stressy. And that is designed, it's built into the puppy as much as it's built into us, this hyper-vigilant state to counter threats, to get us away, to take us into our fight and flight mode. It's for survival. But what happens, or what can happen, is that if we have too much of this going on, or it goes on for too long, we can end up in a state where we are almost permanently stuck in that kind of hypervigilant state. Since the start of last year, but there was a notable increase in trauma symptoms. And there's a study of 4 universities that got together and did a study together and showed that the incidence of anxiety had lifted between March, May and into August. But interestingly, that is the headline figures are starting to decrease. So there's some sense of some adaptation happening there for people. But it's a really complex picture. So let's move into what psychological trauma is and how you can recognize it. So I am using a very simple definition here, and that definition is that trauma occurs when the nervous system becomes overwhelmed by too much stimulation. And that could be too much stimulation, it happening for too long, it happening too soon before we feel ready for it, or too fast. So if you take the example of a young person who is impacted by domestic violence at home, and that young person, it might be one incident that triggers that person into a trauma response where they become hypervigilant, where they become in a state of alertness and awareness that is awaiting for something to happen with one incident. Or it might be that it's a number of incidents that build up in the nervous system over time. So what we might call trigger stacking, where we get more and more triggers. So it might be that a lot's happening all at once. I know for many people through the early stages, certainly of the pandemic here in the UK, that was a very common thing in the work that I was doing, that people, they were just having to deal with so many things all at once. So there's a sense of overwhelm. Now, what happens when we get too much for too long, too soon, or too fast, is our nervous system gets pushed over a threshold, and a part of the brain called the amygdala, bottom left of the screen, the purple blob, it's about the size and shape of an almond, the center of the brain. And it's the part of the brain that decides what's important. So it decides what's important, and then it sends data to either the neocortex, which is where we process things in a lovely, logical, fantastically rational way, to the limbic system, where we process through our emotions and through our, we might invoke memories, because memories are closely linked with that part. Or it might trigger the reptilian brain, which is that bit at the back of the brain. And that's the bit that takes us into our fight or flight mode, where we're ready to fight, or we become terrified, rabbit in the headlights, so we freeze as well, that kind of approach. So this amygdala, when it reaches a certain threshold, we get into a state we call hyperarousal or hypervigilance. And we can stay in this hypervigilance once we've had this too much, for too long, too soon, too fast, near permanently. Or it might be on a real hair trigger. So we might be very close to the edge of high levels of anxiety and that fight or flight mode all the time. But what's really interesting here, and I think this is particularly important where we're in a role supporting or caring for others, is that we can get those raw trauma responses, the anxiety, the fear, even the anger, the lashing out, the boiling over. Really, with adults, we don't see that. We see adaptive responses, and the adaptive responses are, I think, the ones we really need to look out for with people. Not that we would necessarily weigh in there and do anything, but to be markers. So adaptive responses. So this is just a visual representation of this idea of the hyperarousal or hypervigilant zone. So in the center, where that purple bit is, this is when our nervous system is in a normal range. So when you're kind of comfortable, happy, okay, you know, pretty relaxed, you're in that kind of window. And you might get levels of arousal. For example, you might find you're really enjoying something that you're reading, or you hear something outside, the sound of chatter. It's not disturbing in any way. You look out through your front window and your level of arousal has risen up. But when we become traumatized too much, too soon, for too long, etc., we can go outside of that window and so high that we go into this hyper arousal zone, that blue zone at the top. And the problem with that is, it brings with it a lot of stressful feelings. It stresses the body. It diminishes the immune system's responses. But also, it can't be sustained. And so what you tend to get, and this is very, very typical, I see this a lot in the children and young people I work with, you tend to get a hyperarousal state where you might get a lot of stress, anxiety, panic attacks even, anger, and then you get a crash. And part of the system that we have set up, and without going into too much detail here today, there's a nervous system called the polyvagal system, and this nervous system linked up to that part in the brain I talked about earlier, the amygdala. It will have you get hypoarousal then, and this is where what presents is people who feel demotivated, listless, tired, so tired, want to sleep, and don't attend. So you get co-workers that don't come to work, you get young people that don't come to school. So this cycle, this boom and bust cycle, is very typical in somebody who's had traumatic experiences. So I mentioned earlier raw responses to trauma. So you get that, the anger, the anxiety, the panic, and so forth. But very often in people, you'll get these adaptive responses to trauma. And so you will get behaviors like placating, people pleasing. So a response to trauma, this is often one that comes through from being in an environment where in order to survive, you had to try and keep people sweet. You had to try and keep the peace. Blaming and criticizing is another. I mean, we all do a bit of that from time to time, but if it's a way of being, if it's a go-to, then it may be a sign that underneath that is a trauma response. Hyper-rationalizing is where we just try and problem solve all the time. Now we make our to-do lists, and we get really caught up in the idea of we have to solve this problem, and it becomes almost obsessive. Avoiding. So different types of avoiding, and that goes from I don't want to have a conversation that might be a bit challenging, all the way through to I'm going to self-medicate with alcohol, video games, internet pornography, whatever, and lose myself in that avoidance strategy. And then the last one is controlling, and that can be trying to control what's going on around, but it can also be controlling of other people too, controlling resources. So now I'm conscious as I say this that many of you there might be sitting there thinking, oh, I've got all of those. Of course, we all have. We've all got all of those. Those are normal human responses. But what we're talking about here is these, when they come up regularly and in extremis, and when you start to notice that there might be linkages with other like stimuli in the environment, you know, when somebody's asked to present, or when somebody is asked to speak in a small group, that you start to get those sorts of behaviours. That could be a sign that there's something trauma linked going on there. Okay, so that's given some kind of a background about trauma and what it is. What people often talk about when they start to process trauma is that it feels like something floats with them. And this is really interesting. There's a whole raft of research now around the idea that the reason why we feel traumatic, anxious feelings now is somehow linked to an event in the past, but we almost can't make the link there. And that can be because when we are overwhelmed and we go into that hypervigilance, that overwhelmed state, there is an effect that stress hormones, cortisol and adrenaline, have on the hippocampus. The hippocampus is the part of the brain that lays down memory. So what can very often happen is we have a very fuzzy memory or no memory at all of a traumatic event or a period of time where events were happening. And yet we carry the feeling with us. And that's because if the hippocampus is overwhelmed by stress hormones, it doesn't date stamp a memory in the way that we would normally. So I was just going to suggest that, you know, we could probably all say what we did yesterday morning. I actually don't think I can remember what I did yesterday morning. And I think that's been getting worse as we've been going through these various lockdown experiences. But you get what I mean, that over time, we can have their events and we date stamp them and we can say we did this then and we did this at another point. But traumatic memories don't really lay down as memories and they float with us. And so the other thing that comes with trauma is what is called inarticulability. And that is the idea that it's really difficult to explain what it is. I know I've got this feeling. I know when I walk into a room with people, I don't feel okay, but I'm really struggling to put it into words. So that is also a feature of trauma potentially there. So let's move into some solutions for the last few minutes and some ways forward. What I love about what's been done in terms of research with trauma certainly in the last 5 years is that if you're an educator, pretty much everything that you do to make a learning environment safe, calm and esteeming is exactly what you need to both prevent trauma happening, but also to dampen it down. You may even have students in classes whose trauma is actually resolved and healed through that. The way out of trauma, whether it's in a therapeutic environment, a conversational coaching day-to-day environment, in a classroom, in a health setting, the way out of it is always to help the person feel safe and esteemed. And that causes the cycling of the amygdala, the hypervigilance, to calm down. So always be thinking about how can I make this person feel safe? How can I help this person to feel esteem? So it's 5 principles for working with trauma. The first one is, we've kind of touched on it in a way, trauma triggers can be hidden. So you might see that somebody appears anxious, you might read the signs, they might say something. You might notice those adaptive responses that we talked about earlier, the people pleasing, the criticizing and blaming, etc. But it's often very difficult to get at the exact trigger, because so we can't assume we know what it is that's caused that issue. And when we're working with people, it's really helpful to work more with the idea of how can I help this person to feel safe and to feel esteemed, than it is to try and work out, well, what is it that caused that? Trauma triggering can be prevented. Same message. Happy, healthy, esteeming environments, relationships help to prevent trauma from happening. And the opposite is true. It can be inflamed by other people's behaviors. So anything that involves shaming, sarcasm, belittling, invoking fear will inflame a trauma response, and in fact will potentially add to it. So it will stack. Trauma can be downgraded. So the downgrading, same message. Anything that you can do to help the person feel a sense of esteem, give them a space, allow them to withdraw so that they have that space to become less vigilant and to recover is helpful to that. And trauma can be healed. And I think this is so wonderful that now there are so many ways that trauma can be healed. And one of the biggest ways, and I think it doesn't really matter whether you go through a counselling route, a CBT route, a somatic psychotherapy route, whatever route, EFT, Sharon mentioned emotional freedom technique earlier, the process is the same. You're building a sense of positive resources that the person has, a bit like I asked you to do right at the beginning of this session. And then what you do in trauma work is help that person to bring those resources across to the thing that is the trauma trigger, that felt sense that I talked about earlier. So in terms of specific ways of working and more general, in a work setting, a classroom environment, a health setting, your family, anything that you can do that helps a person to become aware of what makes them feel safe and comfortable. It might be a past experience where they showed a strength, some kind of resilience, but it can be as simple as the feeling I get when I snuggle up on the settee with the blanket and the cushion watching TV. That's a resource. That felt sense that person gets there, if we can help them to bring that to a situation where they're triggered. So in other words, the person is clearly having difficulty, they're showing some kind of anxiety. Anything you can do to with their permission, to help them to connect to something that feels good and safe will heal, will resolve, will heal, and will downcycle that. So there are a number of major ways that we can do this. We can use somatic trauma-informed coaching approaches, which are literally what I've just talked about. You have conversation where you build the relationship with the person. With that relationship, you help them to, that's the kind of safe container for them to work in. You then help them to identify all the ways, all the strengths they have, all the ways that they can feel safe and secure. The cushion on the sofa, the time they learned to ride a bike, the feeling they had when they helped a friend last week. And you encourage them to bring that gently to the edge of this somatic felt sense of the trauma. So that's a process that it takes skill, practice, and some training. Emotional freedom technique is the weirdest thing I've ever learned, and it's one of the most effective. Some of you may have come across it before. I know Sharon mentioned it. And we use acupressure tapping points, and we tap those points whilst we are saying a comforting phrase, and whilst we're running a bit of the anxiety or concern that we have. And by tapping these points, we down cycle and heal the traumatic stimulus. We basically turn it down and turn it off. And then the last approach, which relates to the diagram on the right there, Satir transformational practice. And this is an approach where we help people to both use the felt sense of the trauma that they're experiencing in a very carefully controlled way, because one of the most important things about trauma is not to weigh in there. We work very gently and we work on the fringes, and to use several layers of helping a person to both like consciously, cognitively understand, like the feelings they have about the feelings, the beliefs, the expectations, and so forth. And then we help them to use their resources. So it comes back to those strengths and resources again, in this idea of a transformational iceberg. There is one technique that requires absolutely no training, and I've put the link there on the slide so you can go and grab this. And it's how to help a person ground a panic attack. And it's using, again, the sense of this idea of the somatic felt sense. So often a person who's feeling anxious will either indicate towards their chest or explain that's what they're feeling. And we invite the person in a very kind and gentle way to bring their attention down the body to their feet. And we spend some time helping them to pay attention to their feet and how their feet feel. And this approach takes the attention away from the anxious somatic felt sense, and starts to give them a place that feels safe and relieving. So I'll leave you to head off at some point and have a look at that. So just to wrap up then, if anybody's interested in learning more about those three approaches, there is a self-study program that starts in March, and there are details in the PowerPoint and a link to follow. So if it interests you to, it's a 9-hour program. If it interests you to find out more about those approaches, please feel free to head off and have a look at that. Main takeaways from today: be patient, because everyone is at a different stage of that change cycle, including ourselves. Trauma shows up in both raw ways, the anxious, panic, angry, but also in adaptive ways, those 5 adaptive ways. It's an automatic survival response. We're supposed to have it, but sometimes it becomes crippling to us. Trauma responses are downgraded and healed by making people feel safe and raising their self-esteem. And high levels of trauma response might be a sign of somebody needs some signposting to some other services. So I guess that's an important point to take away today. Unless you are really well versed and really well trained, what you're doing is containing, supporting, but above all noticing. And if you see signs, then knowing where to signpost people to, and I know that's really hard at the moment because you can signpost and then you get the waiting list. But in the meantime, you can still continue to do that, help them to feel safe, help them to raise their self-esteem. And I think the last important thing is you can learn some really simple and effective approaches to working with people to reduce trauma. So there are some other resources you might want to be aware of. The recording Grounding Panic Attack, which you can get on at the link there. There's also an article that expands on that change cycle. If you want to know more, got any specific questions that we don't have time for today, then drop me an email, and the information is there about the CPD program. If you want to read about this, there is a fabulous book by Julia Vaughan Smith, Julie Vaughan Smith, Coaching and Trauma, which is really well written and comes at it from a coaching rather than a therapeutic, psychotherapeutic approach.